The air in the makeshift central command post, a reinforced concrete shell bolted precariously onto the side of a mountain ridge in the unpronounceable border territory, was thick with the synthetic medicinal odor of air filtration, mixed with the undeniable sharper tang of stale coffee grounds and 3 days of unwashed human sweat. It was a smell endemic to bases where the mission had extended beyond the planned operational cycle, where the personnel were running on the frayed edges of their reserves. Agent Kowalski stood precisely at attention, though the posture felt less like a display of respect, and more like a necessary structural support for a body that felt hollowed out and heavy all at once. Her uniform, a faded desert tan standard issue, was not merely dirty, it was impregnated, with the grit of 100 miles of forced march across fractured shale and pulverized rock. A seam was splitting visibly at the left shoulder, and the fabric, usually stiff, had become soft and shapeless from repeated exposure to dust, rain, and the abrasive internal friction of ballistic vest plates. She was waiting in front of the primary data console, a bank of aging screens flickering nervously in the low, aggressive yellow light of the command bunker. Behind the console, elevated slightly on a makeshift platform constructed of old pallets, stood General Thaddeus Brennan. Brennan was a study in clinical contrast to the environment. His uniform was crisp, the 4 silver stars pinned to his shoulders catching the light and refracting it in tiny, sharp glints. His boots, polished to a mirror sheen, clicked on the grating of the metal floor with a precise, irritating regularity that spoke of endless hours spent on parade grounds, not in the field. He possessed the soft, well-fed features of a man who had not known a caloric deficit in 40 years, and his hands, clasped loosely behind his back, were conspicuously clean, lacking the deep-set grime that stained the knuckles of every operator in the room. He had been addressing the assembled group of junior analysts, all sleep-deprived, faces illuminated sickly by monitor glow, on the necessity of procedural rigidity. It was a speech Kowalski had heard variations of since she enlisted, a monotonous drone about forms and proper signature chains. Brennan paused, his eyes small and cold, sweeping across the dozen weary faces. His gaze snagged on Kowalski, lingering on the visible split in her uniform shoulder. His lips curled into a faint theatrical smile, designed for maximum public humiliation. "And who, might I ask?" Brennan began, his voice a rich baritone boom that seemed entirely too loud for the confined space. "Is this shining example of field discipline? We are discussing the integrity of the chain of command, young man. Or woman. I cannot quite tell under all that dust." A ripple of uncomfortable tittering spread among the junior staff. Brennan had successfully diverted the monotonous briefing into a brief, cruel entertainment. He took a single slow step forward, allowing the weight of his rank, the audible, sharp click of his leather heel, to fill the sudden silence. Kowalski kept her eyes fixed on a point just above the general's left shoulder, the corner where the concrete wall met the ceiling, and where a small, persistent drop of condensation periodically pooled and fell. She inhaled slowly, the gritty air scratching at her throat. She could smell the ozone from the aging electronics, the faint metallic scent of tension, and closer now the crisp, expensive scent of Brennan's freshly dry-cleaned uniform, a scent utterly alien in this place. "I asked a question, Agent," Brennan pressed, stretching the final word out slightly, emphasizing its generic quality. "In this command post, we adhere to basic military courtesy. State your name and your rank, clearly." Kowalski's jaw tightened, a nearly imperceptible movement hidden beneath the grime. She was profoundly exhausted, an exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue, settling into the marrow of her bones. She was tired of the performative masculinity, tired of the bureaucratic theater, and intensely tired of men like Brennan, the soft, protected infrastructure that consumed the sacrifice of the sharp, hard edge. She opened her mouth, but only the name of her cover rank emerged, a simple, irrelevant designation assigned to her 3 years ago as part of the most restrictive possible cover identity. "Agent First Class Kowalski, General." Brennan laughed. It was a short, sharp bark that made 3 of the junior analysts instinctively flinch. "Agent First Class," he repeated, savoring the banality of the title. He leaned closer, violating the standard military boundary, forcing Kowalski to subtly shift her weight, preparing for a potential reaction she hoped wouldn't be necessary. "Let me be candid, Agent Kowalski. You look like you just crawled out of a sewer drain. We have junior analysts here, fresh out of Quantico, who maintain a better appearance than you. I suppose you are one of the data entry grunts sent up here to categorize outdated sensor readings. The kind of soldier we keep safely behind 3 layers of perimeter, running forms and pouring coffee. The silence now was heavy, punctuated only by the low hum of the servers and the distant rhythmic thump of a generator outside. The junior analysts ceased tittering. They had recognized that this had crossed the line from playful reprimand to outright focused demolition. Kowalski did not move. She felt the insult not as a personal attack, but as a dull, irritating vibration, like a toothache that had become chronic. Brennan's words were irrelevant, meaningless noise. The true weight she carried rendered his opinion lighter than the dust clinging to her sleeve. She remembered the feel of a different type of dust. She closed her eyes for a fleeting, microscopic fraction of a second, but it was long enough for the memory to flood the sterile, fluorescent-lit bunker with the blazing, overwhelming heat of the Afghan plateau. It had been 122 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, except there was no shade, just the relentless, unforgiving hammer of the sun beating down on the cracked earth of Helmand Province. The year was 2018, and Agent Kowalski, then simply Lieutenant Kowalski Field Reconnaissance, had been tasked with an extraction run. It was a simple, brutal operation. Locate a compromised intelligence courier, secure the package, and bring the team home intact. The smell of the place was the first thing that always hit her. The acrid, burnt sugar sweetness of diesel fumes mixed with the ancient, dry scent of pulverized sandstone and, underlying everything, the faint, disturbing hint of human and animal waste baking in the heat. It was a visceral environment, hostile to life, demanding constant, microscopic attention. Her gear weighed 85 pounds, a second skin of Kevlar, ceramic plates, ammunition, water, and specialized sensor equipment. The weight was a comfort, a necessary burden, but after 5 straight days on minimal sleep, moving through the wadis and dry riverbeds, the weight had turned malevolent, an invisible hand pressing down on her spine. She was walking point, just ahead of Staff Sergeant Miguel Reyes, her communications specialist, and 3 other operators. Her eyes scanned the ground in a practiced figure-8 pattern, not looking for the large, obvious disturbances, but for the subtle discrepancies, the single, misplaced pebble, the unnatural darkening of the soil, the faint, almost psychic wrongness that told a trained eye that the earth had been disturbed within the last 72 hours. Reyes's voice, low and slightly strained by the heat, crackled softly in her earpiece. Kowalski, we're 2 clicks from the LZ. I'm showing minimal thermal signature variance. Looks like we're running clean. Stay sharp, Reyes, she murmured back, her voice rough. She wiped a bead of sweat that threatened to sting her eye. The sweat tasted intensely salty, already carrying the minerals leached from her system. They had been lucky so far. Too lucky. The terrain felt silent, too silent. The only sound was the crunch of their own boots on the loose aggregate, a sound that seemed ridiculously loud in the vast, empty space. She remembered the visual detail with agonizing precision. They were passing a small, crumbling stone wall, the remnants of an ancient agricultural compound. The sun struck the wall at an angle that created deep, stark shadows. Her gaze swept from the wall back to the path immediately ahead of her. There was a section of ground, about 3 feet by 2 feet, that looked precisely right. The color matched the surroundings. The density of the pebbles was correct, but something was wrong. It wasn't a sight. It was an absence. The air around that patch of ground felt dead. Normally, the air vibrated with the micro-movements of insects, the slow shift of dust motes, the slight eddy currents created by the rising heat. Here, there was nothing. It was a pocket of complete, unnatural stillness. It took less than half a second for her processing center to scream the alarm. Disturbance. Low-profile pressure plate. Contact. Disperse. IED. IED. Her voice tore out of her throat, thick with urgency, amplified instantly by the comm system. She didn't hesitate. Training dictated hitting the deck and seeking cover, but the team was exposed, in a kill zone. She took a single, desperate, explosive step sideways, twisting her body and driving her shoulder into the chest of Sergeant Reyes, shoving him with every ounce of panicked adrenaline-fueled strength she possessed. Reyes stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock and confusion at her sudden violence. That fraction of a second, that single selfless push, is what saved Reyes's life, though not entirely. It put him just outside the blast radius's lethal core. The detonation was not the clean, cinematic fireball depicted in movies. It was a deafening, overwhelming physical event. It was a focused, upward and outward concussive fist of superheated gas and shrapnel. Kowalski felt the earth jump beneath her. The sound arrived simultaneously with the physical impact. A white flash, a pressure wave that struck her like a sledgehammer, driving the breath instantly from her lungs, replacing it with the high-pitched, agonizing scream of tinnitus. She was airborne for what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than half a second, tumbling over the rough ground. She landed hard, the impact jolting up her spine and slamming her helmet against the dirt. Everything went gray and silent, except for the unbearable piercing whine in her ears. When she fought her way back to consciousness, a brutal, nauseating struggle against shock and vertigo, the world was rendered in muted colors, obscured by a dense chemical smoke that smelled sickeningly of gunpowder and vaporized plastic. Her first instinct was to check her extremities. She could move her fingers. She could move her legs. Her armor had absorbed the worst of the impact, but her shoulder, the same shoulder that now bore the torn fabric in the command center, was screaming, already swelling beneath the plate. She rolled onto her stomach, coughing deeply, expelling the choking smoke. The silence was unnerving, broken only by a low, persistent groan nearby. Reyes was 30 feet away, slumped against the stone wall. He was conscious, clutching his side, his face smeared with dust and blood. The other 3 operators were not so lucky. The IED had been precisely placed and packed with ball bearings and nails. Kowalski struggled to her knees. She crawled towards the nearest casualty, Specialist Davies. Davies was still, lying face down in the dirt. Kowalski reached out a shaking hand, turning him gently. Davies' eyes were open, but the life was gone. There was a small, precise hole above his left breastplate, where a piece of shrapnel, traveling with impossible velocity, had penetrated a gap in the armor. His blood was already soaking into the parched earth, darkening the pale tan dust to a rich, dreadful mahogany. It was the smell of the blood, hot and metallic, mixing with the dust that cemented the moment. The loss was immediate, total, and absolute. She didn't cry. There was no time for that luxury. The silence meant the enemy was waiting, watching the result of their trap. They had been counting on survivors rushing the scene, setting up the secondary attack. Kowalski forced herself into movement, ignoring the pounding headache and the metallic taste of blood in her mouth. She grabbed her rifle, checked the magazine, and scanned the distant ridges. For the next 4 hours, she led the fight and the extraction. She administered aid to Reyes, pulling shrapnel from his side, cauterizing the wounds with a primitive field kit. She used the bodies of the fallen as temporary cover, firing precise, suppressive rounds toward suspected enemy positions. She maintained radio silence, knowing the enemy was listening. When the extraction helicopter finally arrived, kicking up a blinding, chaotic storm of dust, she was the last one aboard. She hadn't just secured the package. She had carried 2 of the fallen and the injured Reyes half a mile on her back, running on sheer chemical adrenaline and the cold, terrible imperative of leadership. She remembered looking down as the helicopter lifted off, seeing the dark, bloody stains on the ground where her team had fallen. The sacrifice was hers to carry, the weight of the men she couldn't save. When she finally returned stateside, she wasn't Lieutenant Kowalski anymore. She was a different entity, forged in compression and heat. Her capability had been noted, filed away, and immediately classified. The Pentagon didn't want a medal. They wanted a weapon. They didn't want a field officer. They wanted a mind that could predict and circumvent the very traps she had survived. She had been absorbed into the highest echelons of deep analysis and personal security, her actual rank and identity subsumed under layers of operational security designed to make her completely invisible to men like General Brennan. Her official rank of Agent First Class was the cheapest, easiest discardable rank available, a rank that meant nothing, allowed her to observe everything, and provided the perfect, filthy, exhausted cover. The memory, visceral and sharp, receded back into the iron cage where Kowalski stored her trauma, leaving behind only the residue of exhaustion and a renewed, profound irritation. General Brennan was still waiting for her response. his large manicured hand resting condescendingly on the edge of the data console. "Well, Agent Kowalski?" he prompted, the impatience evident in the slight vibration of his voice. A data grunt. That explains the lack of polish. Perhaps if you spent less time scavenging for supplies and more time ensuring your quarterly report metrics were compliant, you wouldn't appear quite so detrimental to morale. He chuckled again, a forced theatrical sound that grated on her nerves. The dozen junior analysts in the room looked down at their monitors, trying desperately to become one with the blinking status bars, wanting only for the moment to pass. Kowalski inhaled again, slowly counting to 5. She felt the muscle in her left cheek twitch involuntarily. She knew the protocol. She was supposed to respond with a concise, non-confrontational statement, perhaps an apology for her appearance, promise to rectify the uniform violation, and return to her assigned task of monitoring Level 3 encryption flows. She did none of these things. She simply held his gaze. Her eyes, usually dark and focused, were currently bloodshot and underlined by deep purple shadows, but in their depths, something hard and diamond-like gleamed. It was the look of a person who has already confronted mortality and found everything else utterly inconsequential. Brennan, accustomed to the immediate submission of subordinates, found this steady, silent gaze profoundly unnerving. His posture stiffened subtly. He was expecting sheepishness. He got granite. "Are you failing to understand my direct order, Agent?" Brennan's voice lost its jovial theater and took on a sharper, purely authoritarian edge. "I asked you to explain your dereliction of basic standards." Kowalski finally spoke, her voice low, measured, and dangerously calm. It was a voice that hadn't been raised in years, trained for radio communication and critical whispers, not for confrontation. "General, my current operational parameters require me to maintain my status as outlined in compartmentalized Directive 7 Alpha. My appearance is a function of those parameters." It was the use of the word directive that caused the first tiny crack in Brennan's composure. Directives in their world were not memos. They were immutable operational frameworks. "Directive 7 Alpha?" Brennan scoffed, regaining his swagger quickly. "I approve all directives flowing through this command. There is no 7 Alpha associated with any analyst pool, Kowalski. Are you attempting to mislead a superior officer with obscure bureaucratic jargon? Perhaps you should stick to simple English, Agent." He paused, leaning in further, his face inches from hers. She could smell the faint, minty freshness of his breath, another sign of his privileged detachment from the realities of the field. "I'll ask you one more time, Agent Kowalski. State your actual current rank, your mission priority level, and the name of your supervising officer. Right now." Kowalski felt the profound physical struggle within her. The cover identity was paramount. It was designed to keep her invisible, to keep the threat away from the core operations she protected. Revealing her true status was the nuclear option, reserved only for scenarios involving immediate, catastrophic threat to national assets, or apparently, extreme bureaucratic incompetence. Her silence stretched, becoming an audible tension in the room. One of the analysts nervously cleared his throat. She knew she couldn't give him her actual rank, which was non-existent in the traditional sense, a deliberately obfuscated title tied directly to the executive office. She couldn't give him the supervising officer, which would immediately trigger the alert level, but she had to provide something that would stop this man from interfering with her surveillance pipeline, which was currently monitoring a zero-day exploit attempt against the Joint Chiefs network itself, the very network Brennan was supposedly guarding. His interrogation was a dangerous distraction. She looked him directly in the eyes. They were the eyes of a creature that exists in the shadows, constantly calculating threat vectors. "General," she began, her tone utterly devoid of deference, "I am understanding orders not to disclose specifics. This is a need-to-know environment. I recommend you focus on the network perimeter breach attempt currently registering 0.03 seconds from hitting the server farm, rather than my sartorial choices." Brennan's face flushed scarlet. He pounded his immaculate fist on the edge of the console, the sound cracking sharply through the silence. "Insubordination! You will not dismiss me, Agent. This is not a request. This is an order. Give me your full authorization code and your rank right now, or I will have you removed from this facility. Charged with—" He stopped mid-sentence. He realized he was yelling at a subordinate who refused to break eye contact, who exhibited zero fear, and who had just mentioned a network breach that, according to his low-level monitoring dashboard, didn't exist. "Code, now!" Kowalski sighed, a deep, heavy exhalation that sounded like the scraping of metal on stone. The time for maintaining the cover was over. Brennan's continued questioning was now the greater threat, consuming operational time they did not have. She leaned infinitesimally closer, her voice dropping to a harsh, vibrating whisper, a sound that seemed to suck the surrounding noise out of the room. "You want my code, General? Fine." She paused, allowing the gravity of the decision to settle in the atmosphere. The memory of the dust, the blood, and the cost of her clearance settled upon her. She looked away from Brennan and shifted her gaze to the junior analyst sitting at the central keyboard array, a young woman named Peterson, who was watching the scene unfold with terrified, wide eyes. "Peterson," Kowalski ordered, her voice now clipped and authoritative, cutting through Brennan's bluster like a laser. "Clear the input field, maximum security protocols, authorization input required, voice authentication override." Peterson, recognizing the sudden radical shift in atmosphere, the sheer, unqualified authority in the data grunt's voice, froze for a moment, then, driven by an instinct deeper than obedience to rank, began typing furiously. The screen flickered, dropping all benign data streams and displaying a single, stark white field bordered by a throbbing red line. Brennan, sputtering, reached out to grab Kowalski's arm. "What the hell are you doing? I did not authorize." Kowalski didn't flinch. Before his fingers could connect with her sleeve, she took a tiny, sharp step back. Her motion was fluid, instantaneous, and entirely reflexive, the movement of someone trained to evade physical contact in extreme close quarters. She turned her head slightly back toward the microphone embedded in the console, ensuring her voice would be registered precisely. She articulated the word slowly, deliberately. Each syllable was a hammer blow against the fragile structure of the command center's bureaucracy. "Designation," she began. Then, the final, absolute word. A single Polish term used exclusively in the highest-level operational documents. A word that represented not a person, but an entirely classified function. "Tien." She waited for the computer to recognize the input. The room remained silent, thick with Brennan's confused rage. "That's it?" Brennan hissed. "Chinch? What in God's name is that, some sort of call sign for your little analyst club? You think some foreign word is going to circumvent my direct authority? I'm relieving you of duty, Kowalski. Now." He reached again, this time with true intent, his frustration boiling over. Before Brennan's hand was halfway to her, the computer system shrieked. It was not a traditional electronic sound. It was a guttural, synthesized alert, a deep, repeating chime that resonated through the floor grating and into the bone marrow. Bong, bong, bong. The main data screen, which had been displaying the generic white input field, was instantly replaced by a blinding, aggressive scarlet overlay. The text that flashed across the screen was centered, enormous, and terrifyingly clear. "Access denied to non-authorized personnel. Gebudi Machin. System alert. Nivel 5, Stishlatina Extreme Top Secret. Command Parameter Override, Executive Office Directive 1A. The entire network array, dozens of monitors surrounding the analysts, did not simply flash an alert. They shut down instantly, going to a complete black screen, before a secondary distinct system, a hidden redundant layer, booted up on a select few. These screens, now glowing a sterile cold blue, displayed only a single revolving graphic, the seal of the President of the United States, embossed in pure white light. The analyst, Peterson, who had typed the input, recoiled from the keyboard as if it had delivered an electric shock. Her breath hitched, a tiny strangled sound in the sudden overwhelming noise of the alarm. General Brennan's face, moments before florid with rage, went instantly pale, the blood draining away to leave his features slack and bewildered. He stared at the screen, then back at Kowalski, a flicker of true, unadulterated fear replacing the bureaucratic annoyance. Nivel 5, Stishlatina. In the NATO military structure, Level 5 was the highest classification level, reserved for operational details concerning nuclear command and control, and the continuity of government itself. But there was another term visible in the tiny text scrolling at the bottom of the alert banner. Omega Zero Clearance Active. Omega Zero was not a classification known to General Brennan. It was a designation invented less than a decade ago, designed for one singular operational function: the personal security consultant to the president, tasked with auditing the security posture of the entire military infrastructure against internal and external threats, often operating without the knowledge of the chain of command. Kowalski, the junior analyst grunt, was literally auditing him. The bong 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 continued, shaking the very structural integrity of the command center. On the central command desk, a secure satellite phone, a device always kept on silent, always reserved for the highest echelons, began to ring, an insistent, drilling buzz that cut through the alarm noise. It was labeled in simple white stenciling, POTUS 1. Brennan stared at the phone, his mouth agape. He knew instinctively that this phone had never, in the history of this temporary command post, been used. It was there as a theoretical backup, a symbolic link to the highest authority. Now it was screaming for attention, triggered by the entry of a single codename. Kowalski reached out, her movements still precise and economical, and lifted the handset. She ignored Brennan completely, her focus now entirely on the immediate crisis. CN Actual, she said into the receiver, her voice regaining its professional, clipped military cadence. Status report. A voice, tight with alarm and thick with the sound of wind and rapid movement, spilled from the earpiece. It was Admiral Thorne, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. CN, we have multiple threat indicators spiking on your input. What is your status? Identify hostile action. Is the command post compromised? Kowalski lowered her voice, speaking only loud enough for the microphone to register, effectively locking Brennan and the analysts out of the conversation, while forcing them to witness the terrifying reality of her position. Negative, Admiral. Command post is secure. Operational environment nominal. Threat assessment initiated by General Brennan's failure to adhere to disclosure protocols. System override was necessary to prevent a procedural security breach. I need a clean channel priority 1 to the NSC-2 feed now. The zero-day threat is active. Tell the President his security protocols are currently being routed through a general who confuses operational security with uniform neatness. She hung up the phone. The bong, bong, bong finally ceased, replaced by the eerie, overwhelming silence of the now paralyzed command center. Brennan's face was slick with a sudden cold sweat. The realization of the profound, potentially career-ending error was dawning on him with painful clarity. He was no longer worried about Kowalski's uniform. He was worried about the continuity of his entire existence. He watched as Kowalski's long, grimy fingers moved across the keyboard Peterson had abandoned. She was navigating the system with a speed and fluidity that spoke of total mastery, bypassing layers of security that Brennan didn't even know existed. On the blue screens, data began to flow. Not simple analyst reports, but terrifyingly complex real-time threat matrices, firewall integrity reports, intrusion vector analysis, and global positioning data for assets Brennan wasn't even aware the military possessed. Kowalski worked for 3 intensely silent minutes, her breathing steady, deep, and slow, a control technique honed under fire. The only sound was the subtle, rapid click of the keys beneath her fingers. Finally, she leaned back, her task complete. The blue screens reverted back to black, then back to the mundane green status reports. The crisis was averted, the zero-day exploit countered, the breach sealed. She looked at Brennan. The look was not one of triumph or malice, but of cold, dismissive assessment, the same way a technician might look at a faulty circuit board. Crisis averted, General, Kowalski stated. The exploit was contained. The system is clean, but the vulnerability remains active in the network structure you inherited. Brennan stammered, trying to find his voice, trying to reclaim the authority that had evaporated like water on hot pavement. Kowalski, Agent, I demand to know what is going on here? This level 5 alert, you can't just... I can, Kowalski interrupted, her voice entirely flat. And I did. And you know precisely what is going on, General. You were attempting to interfere with the highest level of Executive Office security audit, demanding disclosure of classified access codes in an unsecured environment during an active threat engagement. She slowly pushed up the left sleeve of her battered uniform jacket, revealing the lower part of her forearm. The skin beneath was startlingly white in contrast to the grime on her hand. Etched into the inside of her wrist, just above her radial pulse, was a tiny, intricate tattoo. It wasn't a military symbol or a unit crest. It was a perfect, miniature representation of the presidential seal, tattooed in fine, deep black ink. Beneath it, in minuscule script, were the words, "Ad visum non datum," not given to sight. This was not a decoration. This was her permanent physical identity verification. Brennan's gaze locked onto the seal. The implications of that symbol, placed on that specific part of her body, were immediate, profound, and utterly devastating. The blood that had drained from his face earlier now threatened to pool somewhere near his stomach. The sound of rapidly approaching synchronized footsteps echoed down the main corridor, leading to the command bunker. They were not the scattered, hesitant steps of junior personnel. They were the heavy, measured tread of high-ranking officers moving with terrifying urgency. The solid, blast-proof door at the end of the room swung open with a pneumatic hiss, and the room was instantly filled with the imposing presence of 4 men, generals and admirals, all in full, meticulously pressed dress uniform, their faces grim and set. Leading them was Admiral Thorne, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a man whose reputation was built on his brutal efficiency and utter lack of tolerance for error. Flanking him were General Hayes, Chief of Staff of the Army, General Richter, Commandant of the Marine Corps, and Admiral Vance, Chief of Naval Operations. The moment they entered the room, their eyes did not sweep to the confused General Brennan, who was the ranking officer in the facility. Their eyes went straight to the center of the room, to the small, exhausted figure standing beside the central data console, the grime-stained Agent Kowalski. They had been scrambled from a secure video conference session, rushing across the base on the strength of a single cryptic authorization code and a chillingly brief phone call. The chairman, Admiral Thorne, halted 3 feet from Kowalski. His eyes, usually cold and assessing, were clouded with a deep respect bordering on reverence. He saw not a dirty data analyst, but the living, breathing manifestation of the president's trust, the ultimate auditor, the ghost who walked the highest clearance corridors. Brennan, regaining a sliver of his bravado, stepped forward, attempting to assert his presence. "Admiral Thorne, sir, I assure you, there's been a massive security violation here. This Agent Kowalski, she's disrupted all protocols and accessed Level 5 files. I was just about to have her detained." Thorne did not look at Brennan. He didn't even blink. He acted as if Brennan was an inconvenient buzzing fly. Kowalski slowly lowered her sleeve, covering the presidential seal tattoo once more. She was looking at Thorne with the direct, unblinking assessment of a peer, or perhaps a supervisor. Thorne didn't waste a word on greeting or explanation. He simply executed the one singular gesture required when standing before the office of the presidency's personal security consultant, a gesture that acknowledged the burden she carried, the secrecy of her mission, and the absolute authority she possessed to tear down their entire structure if necessary. Admiral Thorne brought his hand up in a perfect, sharp military salute. The crack of his hand hitting his brow was precise and loud in the silent room. General Hayes, General Richter, and Admiral Vance followed suit simultaneously. 4 stars, 3 stars, 4 stars, 4 stars. The weight of the United States military brass, standing in the middle of a dusty command bunker, rendering the highest possible honor to a woman whose official rank was Agent First Class, and whose current appearance suggested deep operational fatigue and poor hygiene. The collective sound of the 4 hands snapping to attention was the final devastating punctuation mark to the scene. General Brennan stood transfixed, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides, his polished boots seeming suddenly ridiculously large and clumsy. He watched the Joint Chiefs salute the person he had just publicly humiliated, mocked for her rank, and threatened with arrest. The cold sweat on his face intensified, mingling with the heat of the room. He felt a profound physiological nausea rise in his throat. His knees started to tremble subtly, the vibration running down to his shiny boots. He tried to process the scene. A junior agent, covered in dust, now accepting the synchronized salute of the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff. He realized with sickening clarity that Agent Kowalski was merely the sheath. Xian, Shadow, was the weapon, the personal, unreviewable instrument of the Commander-in-Chief. He had insulted the President's shadow. Thorne held the salute for a moment, a moment that stretched into an agonizing eternity for Brennan. When Thorne finally lowered his hand, his eyes finally shifted, sweeping past Kowalski to land on Brennan. The look was not fury. Fury suggests passion. This was colder, deeper. It was the look of absolute surgical disappointment. "General Brennan," Thorne's voice was low, resonant, and steady. "You have just interfered with a Level 0 security audit initiated directly by the Executive Office. You jeopardized a 0-day counteroffensive through gross negligence and a catastrophic failure of judgment." Brennan swallowed hard, the sound audible in the profound silence. "Admiral, I was unaware of her designation. She refused to give me her rank. She was completely outside of standard protocol." Kowalski stepped forward, her movement drawing all attention. Her exhaustion was still visible, but the authoritative weight of her position now lent her a daunting gravity. "General, my designation is outside of your standard protocol," Kowalski stated, her voice quiet but carrying the immutable weight of command. "My protocols are governed by the immediate safety of the Oval Office infrastructure. I am authorized to assume command of any facility, disable any communication, and utilize any resource necessary to secure the continuation of government. Your rank, while respectable within your structure, is irrelevant to mine." She paused, letting the finality of her words settle. "You asked for my rank, General. My rank is Tsiing. My office is the integrity of the system you almost compromised. And my code, which you heard, triggered an automatic notification that brings the Joint Chiefs to attention." Admiral Thorne stepped in, placing a reassuring hand on Kowalski's shoulder, a gesture that spoke volumes about their relationship, not superior to subordinate, but protector to essential asset. "General Brennan," Thorne continued, his voice hardening, "you are relieved of all command duties effective immediately. You will escort yourself to the administrative facility. You will await the arrival of the Inspector General's team. All of your electronic access will be revoked within the next 60 seconds. Brennan didn't argue. He couldn't. The fear was paralyzing. He looked at the junior analysts, now staring at him with a mixture of terror and shocked comprehension. The theater of his authority had collapsed into dust. He felt the tremors increase, his tailored uniform suddenly heavy and suffocating. He realized that the dust on Agent Kowalski's uniform was the mark of honor. His pristine polish was merely the sign of his sheltered irrelevance. Brennan finally managed to nod, a stiff, robotic motion. He turned slowly, his gleaming leather shoes clicking once, twice, before he moved towards the door, his spine suddenly curved and defeated. The sound of his departure was the quietest noise of the entire confrontation. As Brennan disappeared, Admiral Thorne looked back at Kowalski. "Tsiing, what do you need? What is the next vector?" Kowalski was already moving back to the console, pulling up a highly classified internal affairs log. She was looking at a file marked, "Brennan, T. Financial Irregularities." "Admiral," she said, not looking up, "I need the paperwork initiated. General Brennan was a critical vulnerability. The integrity assessment is ongoing. And please," she added, her voice carrying a final, weary note of command, "send me someone who knows how to make decent coffee. This place smells like a bureaucratic trap." The 4 highest-ranking officers in the United States military stood silently, absorbing the order from the exhausted woman in the split, dirty uniform. General Richter stepped forward. "Consider it done, Agent Kowalski, and thank you for your continued service." He gave a slight, respectful nod. Kowalski merely nodded back, her eyes already lost in the rapid, flickering lines of code, the silent, endless war she was eternally tasked to fight. The shadow had retreated back into the data where she belonged, leaving the generals to clean up the mess she had exposed. The weight of the past remained heavy, but the cost of that weight had finally been understood by those who truly mattered.